On the News Channel 5 network, this is Inside Politics.
Hello everyone, I'm News Channel 5's political analyst Pat Nolan. Welcome to Inside Politics. Usually in the spring of a presidential year, the news is dominated by the race to win the party nominations to run in the fall. This year, the political contest is really taking a back seat now to the coronavirus pandemic, which continues to grow across the country, across the world, and here in Tennessee. How much will the outbreak impact presidential politics? And what is the status of the 2020 race after we've seen 2 rounds of major primaries in the last 2 weeks? Our guest to discuss those topics here on Inside Politics this week is Vanderbilt Professor of Science and Political Science and History is Dr. Thomas Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz, thank you again as always for coming on the program. For us here in Middle Tennessee, a further issue that sort of moves presidential politics and just about everything else was our recovery from the terrible killer tornadoes that struck this area last week. We have so much to deal with in so many different areas. People are feeling a lot of overload, aren't they?
Yes, I think this is one of those times. The comparison that comes to my mind, at least in historical experience, is the post 9/11 period, when I think there was an awful lot going on in terms of people's reactions, lots of news, the impact on the economy, obviously very different in many respects, but a little bit of the same sort of sense of overload.
When a president requests prime time to address the nation from the Oval Office, that's probably the ultimate signal that the nation is facing a major crisis. President Trump did that this past week on Wednesday night. It doesn't appear his speech went over very well. Was he expecting a different response?
It's hard to say. This is obviously primetime addresses. Things like this are not his strong suit. He
tried not to admit it, but he made mistakes.
He made mistakes in the speech. He seemed very, to borrow a term from him, low energy. He didn't. It was nervous. It was a stiff, very stiff. He's not a good teleprompter figure, but in a way. The central point, the news item out of it, was the ban on travel to Europe or people coming from Europe, which really seems really kind of very, very modest in terms of trying to deal with this epidemic.
Well, the virus is already here. Keeping people here from coming over from Europe won't help necessarily keep the virus from being out of here.
Right.
What does the president do after this particular speech to make a better first impression? Because a lot of people watched that speech and. The reaction has not been good. I
don't think that more speeches will do him much good. My sense here now is that the administration has got to step up. He might be helped, actually. Joe Biden actually gave him the advice of being quiet. He might be helped by being quiet and allowing, for example, there is this talk now that Pelosi and Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, will come up with an agreement and that something might be passed that would show action.
Based on that, as we speak on Friday morning, it appears that the Congress and the administration are working towards that, and based on that alone, the stock market, which fell beyond the basement this week, in fact went into bear territory after an 11-year run on a bull market, they went up 800 to 1,000 points so far in early trading on Friday. Is that perhaps the ray of hope that they'll come up with something, and what will that be? The president talked about wanting to have payroll tax cuts. That doesn't seem to be a part of it. It looks the Congress is going to be mostly let's go help people that are going to be losing their jobs, their hours cut back, can't get out and work because they've become sick with the virus. Is that where you're going to see this congressional thing go?
Yes. Yeah. I think the key will be the psychological lift that comes from, in our very partisan, polarized environment, actually having an agreement, getting a bipartisan agreement, and covering many of those issues, particularly providing aid to people who are going to be most directly affected by this, those who can't telecommute and all of those sorts of things.
One of the early polls that came out after the president's speech found 51% of those responding disapproved of the way the president is handling the coronavirus issue. 39% said they'd be less likely to vote now to re-elect him, but 42% also found they approve of the administration's response, and about 20% said it makes them more likely to vote for him for president. That sounds an awful like the kind of numbers you see for the president's overall job approval numbers. So far, his base is not abandoning him about this?
I think that's right. I think that's right. I don't see yet in the public opinion numbers a great abandonment of the president. What I do see, there is some indication that independents, that small sliver of people who are genuinely undecided or who follow politics less seriously, might find this a deal breaker or might move against the president for it. There's a small number. But I think in terms of the big partisan divisions within our society, I don't see any great change yet.
Both of the remaining major Democratic candidates, former Vice President Joe Biden and Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, gave speeches and presented their own plans for how to handle the virus situation. They took very different tacks in some way. Joe Biden talked about a plan almost as if he was in office for what he would do. Right. Sanders went a little bit more towards how terrible it's going to be, in fact, even compared it to the kind of casualties we see during a war. Which is the best way to approach the American people about this?
Well, my own inclination would be that Biden, both of them are essentially, their responses are geared also toward their political messaging. Biden's political messaging was with the idea of a restoration of normalcy, of calm, and so I think his taking on a sort of presidential aura was part of that stance. In Sanders' case, what Sanders needs is a sense of urgency, and I don't want to say panic, but there is a sense that if you're going to be as revolutionary as Sanders, you need to have people really, really worried in order to get them to vote for you.
He keeps wanting to bring out voters that have not historically voted, and he's trying to build a case for why they really ought to break out and vote.
And vote for him, yes, yeah. I think that's in that sense, there is that sort of almost revolutionary urgency in the Sanders campaign.
In the wake of this in this country, there are those, and the administration plays to this to some degree, they're blaming China for this. This is where this started. They're saying that this is the whole China. If the Chinese had given us more time, they could have done better. But that may be hard to defend, saying that had more time, they'd done better, because they haven't done very well with the time so far, just in terms of the testing alone. The administration keeps saying, well, next week we're going to have the tests out there. We still don't have the tests out there in any major way, while other countries seem to have drive-through things to do this and are handling, at least getting the testing done. And the testing is very important. If they don't know where these people are having this or where the hot spots are going to be, it gets harder and harder to try to deal with it.
That's, yes, I think that's the clearest weakness in the administration's case for handling it competently, is the absence of tests or the absence of the numbers. The president has been giving out mixed messaging on that, particularly sort of assuring people they can be tested when we find out they can't. So yes, I think that's probably the greatest weakness the president's going to face, is this testing issue. And to the extent if the epidemic does skyrocket, I think they will be very, very vulnerable on that point.
Dr. Thomas Schwartz of Vanderbilt University, political science and history professor there, is our guest. We're talking about the coronavirus, its